In the autumn of 1847, 20 of America's most skilled swordsmen gathered in a forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Each man carried a reputation forged in blood and steel. Each believed himself unbeatable. By sunset, 19 would lie defeated on the cold stone floor, their pride shattered by a woman they had dismissed as nothing more than an amusing distraction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Carpenter Street as Isabella Morrison adjusted the worn leather grip of her father's rapier. At 23, she possessed an unusual combination of grace and steel that most people failed to notice beneath her modest dress and quiet demeanor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, revealing the sharp intelligence in her green eyes that had unsettled more than one gentleman caller in Boston's high society. Isabella had arrived in Philadelphia 3 days prior, carrying little more than a canvas bag, her father's sword, and a letter that would change everything. The letter, written in her father's careful script just weeks before his death from consumption, contained a confession that had shaken her to her core. Colonel Thomas Morrison, the man she had idolized her entire life, had not earned his reputation through the glorious battlefield victories she had heard about since childhood. Instead, he had built his legend on a lie that had cost another man his honor, his family, and ultimately his life. The truth was far more complicated than the stories told in Boston's dry rooms. Her father had indeed been a skilled swordsman, perhaps one of the finest of his generation, but his most famous victory had been won through deception. During a duel that was meant to settle a dispute over military strategy, Thomas Morrison had used a distraction technique that bordered on cheating. His opponent, Captain Marcus Whitfield, had been struck down not by superior skill, but by a momentary lapse in attention caused by Morrison's deliberate manipulation of the morning sun's glare. What made the deception worse was its aftermath. Captain Whitfield, wounded but not killed, had challenged the validity of the duel. When Morrison refused to acknowledge any impropriety, Whitfield's accusations of dishonor had been dismissed by their fellow officers as the desperate claims of a defeated man. The scandal had destroyed Whitfield's career, drove him to bankruptcy, and ultimately led to his death in a tavern brawl 3 years later, a broken man drowning his shame in whiskey. Isabella's hands trembled as she remembered reading those final paragraphs of her father's confession. Thomas Morrison had carried the guilt for 30 years, watching silently as his undeserved reputation grew while Marcus Whitfield's family suffered in poverty and disgrace. The letter ended with a plea that Isabella could not ignore. "Find them, my dearest daughter. Find Captain Whitfield's surviving family and restore the honor that I stole from them." The search had led her to Philadelphia, where Marcus Whitfield's younger brother, Jonathan, had established himself as the proprietor of a small but respected fencing academy. But Jonathan Whitfield was no ordinary instructor. In the years following his brother's death, he had transformed his grief into purpose, training a generation of swordsmen with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His students were not wealthy gentlemen learning the art for social refinement. They were serious practitioners who understood that the blade demanded respect, precision, and absolute commitment. When Isabella had knocked on the door of Whitfield's academy, she expected to find an old man bent by years of bitterness. Instead, she discovered a sharp-eyed gentleman of 55 whose silver beard could not hide the strength in his jaw or the fire that still burned in his dark eyes. Jonathan Whitfield listened to her story with the patience of a man who had waited decades for this moment. He examined her father's letter with steady hands, his expression revealing nothing of the storm that Isabella sensed was building beneath his calm exterior. "Your father was a coward," he said finally, his words cutting through the afternoon silence of his practice room. "But you, Miss Morrison, appear to be something different entirely." Isabella had expected anger, perhaps even violence. What she received instead was an opportunity that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Jonathan Whitfield proposed a test that would either restore his brother's honor or destroy Isabella's family name forever. She would face the 20 finest swordsmen that Whitfield had trained over the past 3 decades, men who had learned their craft from someone who understood the true meaning of honor and the price of its absence. "If you can defeat them," Whitfield explained, "I will consider your father's debt paid and Marcus's name cleared. If you fail, you will leave Philadelphia and never speak of this matter again. Your father's confession will remain between us, but you will carry the knowledge that the Morrison name was built on shame." The terms were harsh, perhaps even impossible, but Isabella had accepted them without hesitation. She had spent the past 3 years training in Boston under the tutelage of Master Henri Dubois, a French émigré whose unconventional methods had scandalized the traditional fencing community. Dubois had recognized something in Isabella that reminded him of the great female duelists of 18th century France, a combination of natural athleticism, tactical intelligence, and the kind of focused determination that could not be taught. Under Dubois' guidance, Isabella had learned techniques that most American swordsmen had never encountered. She studied the flowing, dance-like movements of the Italian school, the precise mechanical efficiency of the German tradition, and the psychological warfare that had made French duelists legendary throughout Europe. More importantly, she had learned to think beyond the conventional rules that limited most practitioners of the art. Now, standing in the cramped apartment she had rented near the Whitfield Academy, Isabella ran her fingers along her father's blade one final time before securing it at her side. The weapon itself was unremarkable, a standard military rapier with a brass guard and well-worn leather grip, but she had spent countless hours learning its balance, its reach, and its subtle personality. Master Dubois had taught her that every blade has its own character, and success lay not in forcing the weapon to obey, but in learning to work in harmony with its natural tendencies. The warehouse where the challenge would take place had been chosen for its privacy and its space. Located in the industrial district where the Delaware River curved through the city's eastern edge, the building had once housed a textile operation that had failed during the economic panic of 1837. Its high ceilings and open floor provided ample room for combat, while its isolated location ensured that the day's events would remain secret regardless of their outcome. As Isabella walked through Philadelphia's morning streets toward her appointment with destiny, she thought not of victory or defeat, but of the complex web of honor, shame, and redemption that had brought her to this moment. Her father's confession had revealed the fragility of reputation and the terrible weight that deception could carry across decades. Jonathan Whitfield's challenge offered her a chance to transform that legacy, but success would require her to surpass every limit she had previously accepted about her own capabilities. The warehouse loomed ahead, its brick facade dark against the cloudy sky. Smoke rose from several chimneys in the surrounding buildings, and the distant sound of hammers on metal suggested that the city's craftsmen were already hard at work. Isabella paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath of the cool autumn air before pushing open the heavy wooden door that would lead her either to redemption or ruin. Inside, 20 men waited in silence, each one a master of the blade, each one prepared to defend the honor of their fallen teacher's brother against a young woman whose very presence seemed to mock everything they had been taught about strength, skill, and the proper order of the world. The interior of the warehouse stretched before Isabella like a cathedral of combat. Shafts of pale sunlight filtered through grimy windows set high in the walls, creating geometric patterns on the polished wooden floor that had been installed specifically for this occasion. The air carried the scent of leather oil, steel polish, and something else, the unmistakable tension that preceded violence. 20 men stood arranged in a loose semicircle near the far end of the space, their postures revealing years of disciplined training. Each wore simple black clothing that allowed for unrestricted movement, and each carried a rapier that gleamed with the kind of care that spoke of absolute dedication to their craft. These were not the pampered sons of wealthy merchants playing at swordplay. These were Jonathan Whitfield's disciples, forged in the crucible of his bitter grief and uncompromising standards. Isabella recognized the type immediately. Master Dubois had warned her about such men during her training in Boston. "Beware the swordsman who has found religion in his blade," the old Frenchman had cautioned. "He fights not for sport or even survival, but for something far more dangerous: absolute conviction." At the center of the group stood a man who commanded attention without effort. Thomas Brennan possessed the kind of presence that made other men step back instinctively, not from fear, but from recognition of a natural authority that could not be manufactured or faked. His auburn hair showed streaks of premature silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had learned to read opponents like pages in a familiar book. Brennan had been Jonathan Whitfield's first student, arriving at the academy 15 years earlier as a young dock worker whose natural athleticism had caught the master's attention during a street altercation. Under Whitfield's tutelage, he had transformed from a brawling laborer into something approaching artistry in human form. His technique combined raw power with surgical precision, and his understanding of timing bordered on the supernatural. Standing to Brennan's left, Marcus Sullivan represented a different approach to the blade entirely. Where Brennan embodied controlled aggression, Sullivan had perfected the art of patient destruction. His lean frame and quiet demeanor masked reflexes that had earned him victories against opponents who had underestimated the danger posed by his seemingly gentle nature. Sullivan's specialty was the kind of defense that gradually wore down attackers until they made the inevitable mistake that would cost them everything. The third member of what Isabella had already begun thinking of as the inner circle was Vincent Torres, whose grandfather had brought Spanish fencing traditions to America during the previous century. Torres moved with the fluid grace of a dancer. His every gesture suggested coiled energy waiting for release. His dark eyes missed nothing, cataloging details about Isabella's stance, her weapon, and her breathing patterns with the systematic thoroughness of a natural predator. But it was the presence of Jonathan Whitfield himself that truly defined the atmosphere in the warehouse. The academy's proprietor stood apart from his students, his silver beard neatly trimmed and his dark suit immaculate despite the industrial surroundings. He held no weapon, needed no defensive posture, yet Isabella felt the weight of his attention like a physical force pressing against her resolve. "Miss Morrison," Whitfield's voice carried easily across the space, its cultured tones suggesting education that went far beyond his brother's military background. "Before we begin, I feel obligated to offer you one final opportunity to reconsider your position. The men you see before you have dedicated their lives to perfecting skills that most people barely comprehend. They are not the drawing-room duelists of Boston society, content to exchange a few passes before declaring honor satisfied." Isabella moved toward the center of the warehouse floor, her father's rapier singing softly as she drew it from its scabbard. The familiar weight of the weapon in her hand brought a sense of calm that surprised her with its intensity. "Mr. Whitfield, I appreciate your concern, but I didn't travel from Boston to engage in philosophical discussions about the nature of swordsmanship. Your terms were clear, and I have accepted them." A murmur rippled through the assembled swordsmen, some exchanging glances that revealed their thoughts about facing a woman in combat. Isabella had encountered such attitudes before, and she understood both their source and their tactical value. Men who underestimate her because of her gender often fail to recognize threats until far too late to respond effectively. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Very well," Whitfield nodded slowly. "However, I believe some explanation of the rules is warranted. This will not be a formal duel with the elaborate protocols that govern such encounters in polite society. You will face my students in a sequence that I have determined based on their individual strengths and your presumed weaknesses. Victory requires that you defeat each opponent decisively. First blood is insufficient. A man must yield, be disarmed, or be rendered incapable of continuing." The implications of these rules struck Isabella immediately. Traditional dueling emphasized controlled aggression and minimal injury, but Whitfield's challenge demanded something closer to actual combat. His students would not be pulling their strikes or offering quarter when she found herself at a disadvantage. This would be a test of survival as much as skill. "Furthermore," Whitfield continued, You will have no rest periods between encounters. Each subsequent opponent will engage you immediately upon the conclusion of the previous match. By the time you face the final adversaries, you will be carrying the accumulated fatigue of every prior victory, assuming you achieve any victories at all. Isabella nodded her understanding while her mind raced through tactical calculations. 20 consecutive fights without rest would push her physical conditioning beyond any limit she had previously tested. More troubling still was the psychological pressure that would build with each encounter. Even if she proved capable of defeating individual opponents, the cumulative stress of sustained combat might erode her focus at precisely the moment when mental sharpness became most critical. "Who will I face first?" she asked, testing the balance of her rapier with a series of subtle wrist movements that spoke of countless hours of practice. "Benjamin Crawford," Whitfield replied, gesturing toward a compact man with calloused hands and intelligent brown eyes. "He learned his craft in the shipyards before finding his way to my academy. Mr. Crawford understands the practical applications of blade work in ways that more theoretical students often overlook." Crawford stepped forward with the confident stride of a man who had never lost a fair fight. His weapon, Isabella noted, was slightly heavier than her own rapier, a choice that suggested he preferred power over speed in his tactical approach. The brass guard bore the scratches and wear marks of extensive use, evidence that this was a tool rather than an ornament. As Isabella took her position opposite Crawford, she became aware of the absolute silence that had settled over the warehouse. Even the ambient sounds of the city seemed muted, as if the entire world had contracted to encompass only this moment, this space, and the deadly dance that was about to begin. The morning light streaming through the high windows cast sharp shadows on the floor, creating a complex pattern that would shift and change as the combatants moved. Isabella filed this information away along with dozens of other environmental factors that might influence the outcome. Master Dubois had trained her to see every element of her surroundings as opportunity or obstacle, and she would need every advantage to survive what lay ahead. Crawford raised his blade in a formal salute, the gesture carrying both respect and challenge. Isabella returned the courtesy, then settled into the guard position that had become as natural as breathing through 3 years of intensive training. Around them, 19 other swordsmen watched in silence, each studying her technique for weaknesses they could exploit when their own turns came. The real test was about to begin. The clash of steel against steel rang through the warehouse like a church bell announcing the start of something momentous. Benjamin Crawford's opening attack came with the brutal efficiency of a man who had learned swordsplay not in elegant salons but in the unforgiving world of Philadelphia's dockyards, where mistakes carried permanent consequences. His blade swept toward Isabella's right shoulder in a diagonal cut designed to test her defensive reflexes while simultaneously probing for weaknesses in her stance. The strike carried enough force to shatter a lesser opponent's guard, but Isabella had anticipated this approach. Master Dubois had drilled into her that most American swordsmen favored power over finesse, and Crawford's background suggested he would rely heavily on his superior physical strength. Instead of meeting his attack directly, Isabella allowed her blade to yield before his strike, redirecting its momentum while simultaneously shifting her body weight to transform defense into counterattack. Her rapier's point traced a silver arc through the dusty air, seeking the gap between Crawford's extended sword arm and his torso. The technique, borrowed from Italian masters of the previous century, required precise timing and absolute confidence in one's ability to control distance and angle. Crawford's eyes widened as he realized the trap he had walked into, but his reflexes proved equal to the challenge. He twisted away from Isabella's thrust while bringing his blade back in a horizontal parry that deflected her point mere inches from his ribs. The sound of metal scraping against metal created an almost musical note that hung in the warehouse's still air. "Interesting," Crawford murmured, his voice carrying a grudging respect that had been absent moments before. Jonathan warned us you had received unconventional training, but I didn't expect quite such a sophistication. Isabella said nothing. Her attention focused entirely on the micro-expressions that flickered across her opponent's face. Master Dubois had taught her that the eyes often reveal an adversary's intentions before conscious thought could translate into action. Crawford's pupils showed the slight dilation that indicated heightened alertness, while the tension around his mouth suggested he was reassessing his tactical approach. The second exchange began with Crawford's attempt to bind Isabella's blade, a technique that would allow him to control her weapon while delivering a decisive thrust. His execution was flawless by conventional standards, demonstrating the thorough grounding in classical technique that Jonathan Whitfield demanded from all his students. But Isabella had spent months training specifically against such traditional approaches, learning to recognize and counter the patterns that most European swordsmen considered fundamental. She disengaged from his bind with a circular motion that left Crawford momentarily vulnerable, then pressed forward with a series of rapid thrusts that forced him to give ground. Each attack was carefully calculated to reduce her options while preserving her own tactical flexibility. The technique, known as the Spanish circle in Master Dubois' terminology, created a kind of mobile trap that gradually constrained an opponent's movements until they found themselves with nowhere to retreat. Crawford recognized his predicament and attempted to break free with a desperate lunge that carried all the power his dockworker's frame could generate. The attack came within a hair's breadth of success, his blade's point passing so close to Isabella's throat that she felt the whisper of displaced air against her skin. But desperation, no matter how skillfully executed, rarely overcomes careful preparation. Isabella's counter came in the form of a technique she had never attempted outside the controlled environment of Master Dubois' training room. As Crawford's lunge carried him past the ideal striking distance, she pivoted on her left foot while bringing her rapier up in a rising diagonal that caught his extended sword arm just above the wrist. The cut was shallow but precise, severing tendons that controlled his grip strength. Crawford's weapon clattered to the floor as his fingers lost their ability to maintain the hilt on the hilt. He stared down at his useless hand for a moment, then raised his eyes to meet Isabella's gaze with an expression that mingled pain with something approaching admiration. "I yield," he said simply, cradling his injured arm against his chest. The warehouse erupted in a buzz of conversation as Crawford's fellow students absorbed the implications of what they had just witnessed. Isabella had not merely defeated one of their number, she had done so with techniques that most of them had never encountered, demonstrating a breadth of knowledge that challenged their assumptions about both her abilities and their own preparation. Jonathan Whitfield stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he examined Crawford's wound with the practiced eye of someone who had seen countless such injuries over the years. "Michael Peterson," he called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of voices. "You're next." Peterson emerged from the group with the fluid grace of a natural athlete. Where Crawford had relied on strength and straightforward technique, Peterson embodied speed and precision. His lean build suggested a background in activities that demanded endurance rather than raw power, and the way he held his rapier indicated familiarity with more advanced aspects of swordplay. "Miss Morrison," Peterson said as he took his position, "I hope you'll forgive me for learning from Benjamin's experience. I won't be making the same mistakes he did." Isabella wiped her blade clean with a piece of cloth from her belt, using the gesture to buy precious seconds for assessment and recovery. The fight with Crawford had lasted less than 5 minutes, but she could already feel the subtle signs of fatigue beginning to accumulate in her sword arm. 19 opponents remained, and each would presumably prove more challenging than the last, as Jonathan Whitfield escalated the difficulty of her trials. Peterson's opening sequence revealed immediately that he had indeed learned from watching Crawford's defeat. Instead of attempting to overwhelm Isabella with strength, he focused on testing her defensive patterns with a series of probing attacks that revealed information about her preferred responses without committing him to any particular line of assault. His blade work showed the influence of French training, with emphasis on efficiency of motion and economy of effort. The tactical puzzle he presented was entirely different from Crawford's straightforward approach. Peterson fought like a chess master, each move designed to improve his position while simultaneously limiting Isabella's options. His technique was virtually flawless within the parameters of classical European swordplay, and his physical conditioning appeared excellent. But Peterson's very sophistication contained the seeds of his downfall. His reliance on established patterns made him predictable to someone who had studied those patterns extensively. Isabella began to recognize the subtle cues that preceded each of his preferred combinations, allowing her to position herself advantageously before his attacks could fully develop. The decisive moment came when Peterson attempted a complex sequence borrowed from the German school, a feint high followed by a low cut designed to slip under his opponent's guard. The technique required split-second timing and perfect distance control, both of which Peterson possessed in abundance. What he lacked was experience against an opponent who had trained specifically to recognize and counter such advanced maneuvers. Isabella's response came in the form of a technique that Master Dubois had called the Madrid trap, a counterattack that transformed the opponent's advanced technique into a weapon against himself. As Peterson committed to his low cut, Isabella dropped her blade's point while simultaneously stepping forward and to the side. The movement placed her inside Peterson's guard while leaving his sword arm extended and vulnerable. Her thrust took him in the shoulder, penetrating deep enough to ensure he could not continue fighting effectively. Peterson's rapier fell from nerveless fingers as shock and pain registered on his features. He looked down at the wound with the detached curiosity of someone trying to understand how such a thing had become possible. "I yield," he whispered, sinking to one knee as the reality of his defeat settled over him like a shroud. 18 swordsmen remained, and Isabella could see in their faces the dawning realization that they were confronting something far more dangerous than they had initially believed. The afternoon sun had shifted position, casting longer shadows across the warehouse floor and creating new patterns of light and darkness that would influence the battles to come. Isabella stood in the center of the makeshift arena, her breathing controlled but deeper than it had been an hour earlier. Sweat dampened her hair at the temples, and her sword arm carried the first whispers of the fatigue that would eventually become her greatest enemy. Jonathan Whitfield consulted a piece of paper he had withdrawn from his jacket pocket, his eyes moving across what appeared to be a carefully planned sequence of names. His expression remained neutral, but Isabella caught a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested the easy victories were about to end. "David Chen," Whitfield announced, his voice carrying clearly across the warehouse. From the group of remaining swordsmen emerged a man whose presence immediately altered the dynamics of the space. Chen moved with the controlled fluidity of someone who understood his body as a precisely calibrated instrument. His features suggested Chinese ancestry, but his bearing spoke of years spent mastering European fencing techniques while retaining something distinctly his own. The weapon he carried was a rapier like the others, but the way his fingers wrapped around the grip revealed familiarity with blade work that transcended any single tradition. Isabella had heard whispers about David Chen during her brief time in Philadelphia. He was one of the few students at Whitfield's Academy who had come to swordplay already possessing martial skills from another discipline. His grandfather had been a master of Jian, the straight sword of Chinese martial arts, and had passed down techniques that emphasized the harmony between weapon, warrior, and the natural flow of combat. Under Jonathan Whitfield's tutelage, Chen had learned to blend these Eastern principles with Western precision, creating a hybrid style that confounded opponents who expected conventional approaches. "Miss Morrison," Chen said as he took his position, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language but spoke it with careful precision. "I have watched your previous encounters with great interest. Your master Dubois has taught you well, but I wonder if you have encountered the philosophy that views the sword not as a tool of aggression but as an extension of the practitioner's spirit." Isabella adjusted her grip on her rapier's handle, noting how Chen's stance differed subtly from that of his previous opponents. Where Crawford and Peterson had positioned themselves according to classical European forms, Chen's posture suggested readiness to move in any direction without preliminary adjustment. His weight distribution was more evenly balanced, and his sword arm held a kind of relaxed tension that could explode into motion without warning.
"I've found that philosophy matters less than results," Isabella replied, settling into her own guard position. Chen's smile was brief but genuine. "Then perhaps we can teach each other something today." The engagement began differently from Isabella's previous encounters. Instead of testing her defenses with probing attacks, Chen seemed content to circle her slowly, his blade moving in small, almost hypnotic patterns that served no apparent tactical purpose. Isabella recognized this as psychological warfare, designed to unsettle her timing and rhythm. Chen was attempting to impose his preferred tempo on their encounter before the real fighting began. Isabella refused to be drawn into his game. She maintained her position in the center of their improvised circle, turning to keep Chen in front of her while preserving her options for both defense and attack. Master Dubois had warned her about opponents who sought to control the psychological atmosphere of a duel, teaching her that patience often proved more valuable than aggression when facing such tactics.
Chen's first attack came without warning, his blade seeming to materialize at Isabella's throat as if it had simply appeared there rather than traveling through the intervening space. The speed was extraordinary, but more unsettling was the way the assault seemed to flow from his circling movement without any discernible transition. Isabella barely managed to deflect the thrust, her parry coming more from instinct than conscious decision. Before she could recover fully, Chen's blade was already seeking another opening, this time targeting her left side with a horizontal cut that required her to step backward to avoid being opened from ribs to spine. His follow-up came immediately, a rising thrust aimed at her chest that forced her to contort her body in ways that left her momentarily off balance. Isabella realized with growing alarm that she was being systematically dismantled by an opponent whose understanding of combat dynamics surpassed anything she had previously encountered. Chen wasn't simply applying superior technique, he was orchestrating the entire flow of their engagement, making her dance to rhythms he had composed. The revelation came to her suddenly, triggered by something Master Dubois had mentioned during one of their theoretical discussions about Eastern martial philosophy. Chen wasn't trying to defeat her through conventional means. Instead, he was attempting to disrupt her internal sense of timing and distance, forcing her to react to patterns that existed only in his mind. Once he had succeeded in making her completely defensive, he would deliver the decisive blow with the casual efficiency of a master craftsman completing a familiar task. Isabella's counter-strategy required her to do something that violated every instinct Master Dubois had cultivated in her over 3 years of training. Instead of seeking to regain control of the engagement, she had to surrender control entirely while simultaneously creating chaos that neither combatant could predict or manage. Her opportunity came when Chen executed a particularly elegant combination that should have ended with Isabella impaled on his blade. Instead of attempting the desperate parry that he clearly expected, Isabella allowed herself to fall backward while sweeping her rapier in a wild arc that had no basis in any formal technique she had ever learned. The movement was ugly, improvised, and completely contrary to everything she had been taught about proper swordplay. It was also devastatingly effective. Chen's blade passed through empty air where Isabella's torso should have been, while her own weapon caught him across the back of his sword hand with enough force to draw blood and disrupt his grip. As Isabella rolled away from his position and regained her feet, she saw Chen staring at his injured hand with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Impossible," he murmured, flexing his fingers to test their functionality. "That technique, it has no structure, no principle. How could such a thing succeed?" Isabella said nothing, but she understood what had happened. Master Dubois had occasionally mentioned that the highest levels of martial artistry sometimes required the practitioner to transcend technique entirely, moving beyond learned patterns into a realm of pure intuition and spontaneous response. She had never believed such a thing was possible until this moment. Chen attempted to continue fighting, but his concentration had been shattered by the incomprehensible nature of his defeat. His subsequent attacks lacked the flowing precision that had made him so dangerous, and Isabella was able to exploit his confusion with a straightforward thrust that penetrated his guard and forced his surrender.
As Chen withdrew to tend his wounds, Isabella realized that something fundamental had changed in the way the remaining swordsmen were looking at her. Where before she had seen wariness mixed with skepticism, she now encountered something approaching fear. They were beginning to understand that they face an opponent who could not be categorized or predicted according to their previous experience. "Robert Hayes," Jonathan Whitfield called out, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty Isabella had detected. "Your turn." Hayes stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his face pale and his grip on his rapier noticeably tighter than ideal. I felt a moment of pity for him, recognizing that his fear would make him dangerous in unpredictable ways. A frightened swordsman often fights with desperate creativity that could surprise even superior opponents. But as Hayes took his position opposite her, I also felt something else stirring within my consciousness, a growing confidence that bordered on exhilaration. She was beginning to understand that victory might actually be possible, and that realization was transforming her from a young woman hoping to survive into something far more formidable. 15 opponents remained. The warehouse had grown noticeably warmer as the afternoon progressed, and Isabella could feel perspiration gathering between her shoulder blades despite the October chill that seeped through the building's stone walls. Her left leg had developed a slight tremor that she hoped was not visible to the watching swordsman, and the grip of her rapier had become slick with moisture despite the leather wrapping her father had carefully applied years earlier. Robert Hayes approached his starting position with the mechanical precision of a man forcing himself through motions that every instinct screamed at him to avoid. His brown eyes darted repeatedly toward the spots where Crawford, Peterson, and Chen had fallen, as if their defeats had left invisible stains on the warehouse floor that served as monuments to the futility of challenging this deceptively dangerous woman. Isabella recognized the signs immediately. Master Dubois had spent considerable time during her training discussing the psychological aspects of combat, explaining how fear could transform even skilled practitioners into clumsy amateurs who defeated themselves before their opponent struck a single blow. Hayes was experiencing the kind of terror that made hands shake and timing deteriorate, but paradoxically, such fear could also generate the desperate unpredictability that made cornered animals supremely dangerous. "I won't dishonor Master Whitfield's training," Hayes muttered, more to himself than to Isabella. His voice carried the slight tremor of someone fighting to maintain control over his own nervous system. "I won't run from this." "No one expects you to run," I replied gently, recognizing that cruelty toward a frightened opponent served no tactical purpose. "Your master has trained you well. Trust in that training." Hayes nodded jerkingly, then raised his blade in the formal salute that had preceded each previous encounter. But as he settled into his guard position, I noticed something that sent a chill of apprehension through his growing confidence. Hayes had positioned himself at the maximum distance from which an attack could be launched, suggesting that his fear had not paralyzed his tactical thinking entirely. He intended to use her accumulated fatigue against her by forcing her to cover additional ground with each exchange. The strategy revealed itself fully when Hayes opened the engagement not with an attack, but with a rapid retreat that drew Isabella forward in pursuit. As she advanced, he struck with a thrust aimed at her extended sword arm, then immediately withdrew again before she could mount an effective counter. The pattern repeated 3 times in rapid succession, each iteration forcing Isabella to expend energy while Hayes preserved his own strength through minimal contact. Isabella found herself facing a tactical puzzle that her previous victories had not prepared her to solve. Hayes had abandoned any attempt to match her superior technique, instead adopting a strategy of gradual attrition that acknowledged her advantages while exploiting her one genuine weakness, the cumulative exhaustion that grew heavier with each passing minute. Her breakthrough came when she realized that Hayes's strategy contained a fundamental flaw. His retreating attacks required him to move backward while maintaining visual contact with her weapon, a combination that severely limited his peripheral awareness. Isabella began to angle her pursuit slightly to the left, gradually herding Hayes toward a section of the warehouse floor where afternoon sunlight streaming through a high window would create a temporary blind spot.
When Hayes retreated into the bright patch of light, Isabella struck with the kind of aggressive combination that she had been conserving throughout the previous engagements. Her blade work became a silver blur as she pressed forward with overlapping attacks that gave her opponent no time to establish the distance his strategy required. Hayes managed to parry the first 3 thrusts, but the 4th penetrated his guard to nick the artery in his neck. Not deeply enough to prove fatal, but sufficiently to convince him that continued resistance would prove suicidal. "Yield!" he gasped, pressing his hand against the thin line of blood that traced down toward his collar. "I yield, Miss Morrison." As Hayes stumbled away to join the growing group of defeated swordsmen, Isabella allowed herself a moment to assess her physical condition with brutal honesty. Her sword arm ached with the deep, persistent pain that indicated muscle fibers beginning to break down under sustained stress. Her breathing had become noticeably labored, and she could feel the first warnings of cramps in her left calf that threatened to compromise her mobility if the battles continued much longer. 14 opponents remained, but Isabella was beginning to understand that numbers alone no longer told the complete story of her situation. Jonathan Whitfield had been carefully observing each encounter, and she could see in his expression the calculating intelligence of someone making tactical adjustments based on accumulated data about her capabilities and limitations. "Samuel Ward," Whitfield announced, and from the group stepped a man whose physical presence immediately announced that the nature of the challenge had changed again. Ward stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that suggested a background involving heavy manual labor. His weapon appeared almost delicate in hands that could probably crush walnuts without conscious effort, but Isabella noted that his grip remained technically correct despite his obvious strength advantage. "Miss Morrison," Ward rumbled, his voice carrying the slow cadence of someone who chose his words carefully. "I've been watching you fight, and I believe I understand your methods now. You rely on speed and technique to overcome opponents before they can bring their natural advantages to bear. But what happens when facing someone who refuses to be rushed?" Isabella felt a sinking sensation in her stomach as Ward settled into a defensive stance that resembled a fortress more than a conventional guard position. His blade extended toward her like a steel barrier, positioned to threaten multiple target areas while requiring minimal energy to maintain. Ward clearly intended to force her to exhaust herself against his defenses until fatigue made her vulnerable to the kind of devastating counterattack that his strength could deliver. The tactical situation was even worse than it initially appeared. Ward's reach advantage meant that Isabella would have to move inside his optimal striking distance to threaten him effectively. But his defensive position was specifically designed to punish such attempts. Meanwhile, his superior physical conditioning would allow him to maintain his guard indefinitely, while her own energy reserves continued to diminish. Isabella's opening attacks confirmed her worst fears about Ward's capabilities. His parries carried enough force to jar her sword arm painfully, and his ripostes came with the crushing power of a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil. After 3 exchanges, Isabella realized that conventional tactics would prove suicidal against an opponent whose strategy was specifically designed to exploit her accumulated weakness. Her solution came from remembering something Master Dubois had mentioned about the great French duelist Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who had defeated larger opponents by treating swordplay as a form of 3-dimensional chess rather than a simple contest of steel against steel. Isabella began to circle Ward at maximum range, forcing him to constantly adjust his position while she studied the subtle rhythms of his breathing and the micro-adjustments he made to maintain his optimal guard. The pattern she discovered was almost imperceptible, a slight dropping of his blade's point that occurred every 4th breath as Ward's concentration flickered momentarily. The opening lasted perhaps a quarter of a second, but Isabella had trained for 3 years to recognize and exploit exactly such fleeting opportunities. When the moment came, Isabella's attack was not the desperate lunge that Ward expected, but a carefully measured thrust that arrived at precisely the instant when his guard was fractionally out of position. Her blade slipped past his defenses to pierce the muscle of his sword arm, not deeply enough to prove fatal, but with sufficient force to disrupt his grip strength.
Ward's weapon fell from nerveless fingers as he stared down at the thin trickle of blood that marked Isabella's victory. His expression showed not anger or pain, but a kind of wondering respect that transformed his craggy features. "Remarkable," he said softly. "I thought I had accounted for every variable, but you found the one weakness I didn't know existed." As Ward walked away to join the other defeated swordsmen, Isabella realized that something had fundamentally changed in the atmosphere of the warehouse. The remaining 13 opponents were no longer watching her with the mixture of skepticism and wariness that had characterized their earlier attention. Instead, she saw in their faces the kind of focused intensity that appeared when skilled practitioners recognized they were witnessing something that transcended their previous understanding of what was possible. Jonathan Whitfield stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting a man reassessing calculations that had seemed certain only minutes before. "Miss Morrison," he said quietly, "I believe it's time to acknowledge that you have exceeded my most optimistic expectations. However, I feel obligated to warn you that the opponents you have faced thus far represent my academy's competent students rather than its true masters. What follows will test limits that you may not even know you possess." The quality of light filtering through the warehouse windows had shifted to the golden amber of late afternoon, casting longer shadows that stretched across the polished floor like dark fingers reaching toward the center of the makeshift arena. Isabella stood amid this interplay of light and shadow, her chest rising and falling with the controlled rhythm of someone managing exhaustion through sheer force of will. 7 opponents had fallen, and 13 remained, but she could sense that the nature of her trials was about to change fundamentally. Jonathan Whitfield moved closer to the combat area, his weathered features carrying an expression that mingled professional interest with something approaching paternal concern. "The men you will face now," he said, his voice carrying easily across the warehouse's acoustic space, "represent 15 years of my most intensive instruction. They are not merely skilled, they are artists who have elevated swordplay to a form of poetry written in steel and blood." From the remaining group stepped Marcus Sullivan, the lean man whose quiet demeanor Isabella had noted during the initial introductions. As he approached, she realized that everything about him had been calculated to create an impression of harmless competence while concealing capabilities that were anything but ordinary. His gray eyes held the kind of patient intelligence that belonged to someone who had learned to read human nature with the same precision most people reserved for familiar books. Sullivan's weapon was different from those carried by the previous opponents, not obviously so, but with subtle modifications that spoke of years spent perfecting every detail. The guard had been reshaped to provide better protection for his fingers, while the blade itself showed the kind of wear patterns that indicate constant use rather than occasional practice. This was not merely a tool, but an extension of his personality that had been honed through countless hours of dedicated refinement. "Miss Morrison," Sullivan said as he took his position, his voice carrying the soft cadence of someone who had learned that whispers often proved more effective than shouts. "I've been watching you fight throughout the afternoon, and I must say I'm impressed by your adaptability. However, I wonder if you've considered what happens when facing an opponent who has spent the same amount of time studying you." Isabella felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the warehouse's cooling temperature. Sullivan's comment suggested a level of analytical thinking that went beyond simple observation, implying that he had been constructing a detailed tactical profile of her capabilities while she fought his fellow students. If true, she was about to face someone who understood her strengths and weaknesses better than she understood his. Sullivan's opening sequence confirmed her worst fears about his preparation. Instead of testing her defenses with conventional probes, he immediately attacked the specific techniques that had proven most effective in her previous victories. When Isabella attempted the circular disengagement that had defeated Crawford, Sullivan was waiting with a counter that nearly took her head off. When she tried the improvised chaos that had bewildered Chen, Sullivan adapted to her unpredictability with the fluid grace of someone who had anticipated exactly such tactics. For the first time since entering the warehouse, Isabella found herself completely on the defensive, forced to react to threats she could not predict, while facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate her responses before she had consciously formulated them.
Sullivan's blade work displayed the kind of technical perfection that could only be achieved through decades of obsessive practice, but more unsettling was the way he combined that skill with psychological insights that made each attack a dual assault on both her body and her confidence. "You're wondering how I know," Sullivan observed conversationally as his blade traced intricate patterns around Isabella's increasingly desperate parries. "The answer is simple. I've made a career of studying failure. Every student who has challenged this academy, every technique that has failed against our methods, every weakness that has been exposed under pressure. You're very good, Miss Morrison, but you're not unique." Isabella realized with growing alarm that Sullivan was not merely defeating her, he was dismantling her entire approach to swordplay with the systematic thoroughness of a scholar dissecting a familiar text. Each exchange revealed another layer of his understanding, another aspect of her technique that he had already analyzed and prepared to counter. She was fighting not just against his skill, but against the accumulated knowledge of every practitioner who had failed before her. Her salvation came from an unexpected source. As Sullivan pressed his advantage with a combination that should have ended the encounter decisively, Isabella caught a glimpse of something in his eyes that Master Dubois had warned her to watch for in opponents who relied heavily on analytical thinking. Sullivan was so focused on executing his carefully planned assault that he had stopped adapting to the immediate reality of their combat, instead fighting against the Isabella Morrison he had studied rather than the exhausted, desperate woman who actually faced him. Isabella's counterattack abandoned every principle of technique she had ever learned in favor of pure instinctive aggression that could not be predicted because it had no logical foundation. She threw herself forward in a wild lunge that violated every rule of distance and timing, trusting entirely to luck and Sullivan's moment of analytical paralysis. Her blade found his chest an instant before his perfectly executed riposte could penetrate her guard. Sullivan staggered backward, pressing his hand against the wound that had appeared below his collarbone like a red rose blooming on white cloth. His expression showed not pain but a kind of intellectual frustration, as if Isabella had violated fundamental laws of physics rather than simply catching him unprepared for the impossible. "Chaos," he murmured, shaking his head slowly. "Pure, unreasoning chaos. I should have accounted for that variable." He looked up at Isabella with something approaching admiration. "Well played, Miss Morrison. I believe I understand now why Jonathan was willing to arrange this extraordinary test." As Sullivan withdrew to tend to his injury, Isabella became aware that the remaining 12 swordsmen were regarding her with expressions she had not seen before. The wariness was still present, but it was now mixed with something that resembled professional respect. They were beginning to understand that they faced not merely a skilled opponent, but someone whose capabilities transcend conventional categorization. Vincent Torres stepped forward next, his dark eyes holding the kind of predatory intelligence that Isabella had learned to associate with truly dangerous adversaries. Where Sullivan had relied on analytical preparation, Torres radiated the confidence of someone who trusted entirely in his ability to adapt and overcome whatever challenges presented themselves. His Spanish heritage showed in the elegant way he moved, each gesture suggesting the kind of cultural tradition that treated swordplay as an art form worthy of lifelong devotion. "Señorita Morrison," Torres said, his slight accent adding a musical quality to his words. "I have watched my companions fall to techniques they did not expect, strategies they had not encountered, and tactics that defied their understanding of proper swordplay. But I wonder, what will you do when facing someone who expects everything and fears nothing?" Isabella adjusted her grip on her rapier, noting how the leather wrapping had begun to fray under the stress of sustained combat. Her sword arm trembled with exhaustion that could no longer be completely controlled, and she could feel the first signs of tunnel vision that indicated her body was beginning to prioritize basic survival over complex tactical thinking. 12 opponents remained,
but Torres alone might prove more dangerous than all the previous challengers combined. I suppose we'll find out, Isabella replied, settling into a guard position that felt less stable than it had an hour ago. But I've come too far to surrender now. Torres smiled, and the expression transformed his handsome features into something that belonged more in a predator's den than a gentleman's academy. Then let us see what legends are made of, señorita. Let us see if you can transcend the limitations that have defeated every other challenger who has stood where you stand now. As Torres raised his blade in the formal salute, Isabella realized that she was about to face the true test of everything she had learned, everything she had become, and everything she might yet discover about the outer boundaries of human capability under extreme duress. The warehouse had grown dim as evening approached, and Jonathan Whitfield had ordered torches lit around the perimeter of the combat area. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows that transformed the space into something primordial, a place where ancient rituals of combat could unfold without the constraints of civilized society. Isabella stood in this circle of fire and shadow, her body pushed beyond exhaustion into a realm where will alone sustained movement. Vincent Torres circled her with the patient grace of a matador studying a bull, his blade reflecting the torchlight in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. 8 opponents had fallen since the afternoon began, but Isabella could see in Torres's eyes that he viewed their defeats not as warnings, but as valuable intelligence about the woman he now faced. Unlike his predecessors, Torres showed no signs of underestimating her capabilities or overconfidence in his own advantages. "In España," Torres said, his slight accent adding a musical quality to his words, "I have watched my companions fall to techniques they did not expect, strategies they had not encountered, and tactics that defied their understanding of proper swordplay. But I wonder, what will you do when facing someone who expects everything and fears nothing?" Isabella adjusted her grip on her rapier, noting how the leather wrapping had begun to fray under the stress of sustained combat. Her sword arm trembled with exhaustion that could no longer be completely controlled, and she could feel the first signs of tunnel vision that indicated her body was beginning to prioritize basic survival over complex tactical thinking. 12 opponents remained, but Torres alone might prove more dangerous than all the previous challengers combined. "I suppose we'll find out," Isabella replied, settling into a guard position that felt less stable than it had an hour ago. "But I've come too far to surrender now." Torres smiled, and the expression transformed his handsome features into something that belonged more in a predator's den than a gentleman's academy. "Then let us see what legends are made of, señorita. Let us see if you can transcend the limitations that have defeated every other challenger who has stood where you stand now." As Torres raised his blade in the formal salute, Isabella realized that she was about to face the true test of everything she had learned, everything she had become, and everything she might yet discover about the outer boundaries of human capability under extreme duress. The warehouse had grown dim as evening approached, and Jonathan Whitfield had ordered torches lit around the perimeter of the combat area. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows that transformed the space into something primordial, a place where ancient rituals of combat could unfold without the constraints of civilized society. Isabella stood in this circle of fire and shadow, her body pushed beyond exhaustion into a realm where will alone sustained movement. Vincent Torres circled her with the patient grace of a matador studying a bull, his blade reflecting the torchlight in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. 8 opponents had fallen since the afternoon began, but Isabella could see in Torres's eyes that he viewed their defeats not as warnings, but as valuable intelligence about the woman he now faced. Unlike his predecessors, Torres showed no signs of underestimating her capabilities or overconfidence in his own advantages. "Well played, Miss Morrison. I believe I understand now why Jonathan was willing to arrange this extraordinary test." As Sullivan withdrew to tend to his injury, Isabella became aware that the remaining 12 swordsmen were regarding her with expressions she had not seen before. The wariness was still present, but it was now mixed with something that resembled professional respect. They were beginning to understand that they faced not merely a skilled opponent, but someone whose capabilities transcend conventional categorization. Vincent Torres stepped forward next, his dark eyes holding the kind of predatory intelligence that Isabella had learned to associate with truly dangerous adversaries. Where Sullivan had relied on analytical preparation, Torres radiated the confidence of someone who trusted entirely in his ability to adapt and overcome whatever challenges presented themselves. His Spanish heritage showed in the elegant way he moved, each gesture suggesting the kind of cultural.
The tactical situation was unlike anything Isabella had faced during the afternoon's trials. Torres was not attempting to overwhelm her with strength like Ward, nor trying to outthink her like Sullivan. Instead, he was conducting what could only be described as a conversation in steel, each exchange revealing information about both combatants while gradually escalating the level of complexity and danger. His attacks came from angles that should have been impossible, following trajectories that defied conventional understanding of blade mechanics. Isabella realized that Torres was demonstrating techniques that had been passed down through generations of Spanish masters, refinements developed during centuries when swordplay was literally a matter of life and death. His blade work incorporated elements she had never encountered in Master Dubois' instruction. Subtle manipulations of leverage and timing that could transform defense into attack in the space between heartbeats. Her breakthrough came when she stopped trying to match Torres's technical sophistication and instead embraced the exhaustion that was threatening to overwhelm her. Instead of fighting against her body's limitations, she began to use them as tactical assets. Her trembling sword arm created unpredictable variations in her defensive patterns, while her labored breathing introduced irregular timing that confounded Torres's carefully calculated attacks. "Fascinating," Torres murmured as one of his most elegant combinations failed to penetrate Isabella's increasingly chaotic defense. "You are learning to make weakness into strength, disorder into strategy. This is very advanced thinking, señorita." But even as Torres spoke, Isabella could feel her resources reaching their absolute limit. Her vision was beginning to narrow, her reflexes slowing despite her determination to continue. She had perhaps one more exchange left in her before complete collapse became inevitable. Whatever she attempted next would have to succeed because she would not have the strength for a second chance. Torres seemed to sense her desperation, and his next attack came with the flowing inevitability of a natural force. His blade traced a complex pattern through the air that seemed to approach her from 3 directions simultaneously, a technique that Master Dubois had mentioned only in theoretical terms as being beyond the capability of any living practitioner. Isabella's response was not a conscious decision, but a pure expression of trained instinct, refined by desperate necessity. She dropped her guard entirely, allowing Torres's blade to pass within inches of her heart while simultaneously stepping inside his reach and driving her own weapon toward his chest. The movement violated every principle of safe swordplay she had ever learned, but it was also the only action that offered any hope of success against an opponent whose skill exceeded her in every measurable way. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the normal flow of time, the two combatants remained frozen in a tableau that embodied the ultimate paradox of swordplay, the need to risk everything in order to achieve anything. Then Torres stepped backward, Isabella's blade following the motion until its point came to rest against his sternum with the delicate precision of a surgeon's instrument. "Yield," Torres said softly, his eyes holding an expression of genuine wonder. "I yield, Señorita Morrison, not because you have defeated me, but because you have transcended the very concept of defeat through means I cannot hope to understand." As Torres withdrew, the remaining 11 swordsmen stepped forward as one, but not to continue the challenge. Instead, they raised their blades in the formal salute reserved for masters whose skill commanded absolute respect. Isabella stared at them in confusion, her exhausted mind struggling to process what was happening. Jonathan Whitfield walked into the circle of torchlight, his weathered face showing emotions that transformed his stern features into something approaching tenderness. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice carrying across the warehouse with the weight of absolute authority. "There is no need to continue. You have proven what you came here to prove, and more besides." "But I've only defeated 9 opponents," Isabella protested weakly, swaying slightly as the adrenaline that had sustained her began to ebb. "The terms," Whitfield interrupted gently, "were based on my assumption that you were simply another deluded young person seeking to restore a family reputation through gestures that would prove meaningless. I did not expect to witness someone transcend the very boundaries of what I believed possible in the art of swordplay." He gestured towards the men who surrounded them, their faces showing the kind of respect that could not be manufactured or forced. "These men have dedicated their lives to understanding the blade, Miss Morrison. They recognize mastery when they see it, regardless of whether that mastery takes forms they have previously encountered. You have earned their acknowledgement, and through it you have restored your father's honor in the only way that truly matters." Isabella felt her knees buckle as the full weight of exhaustion finally claimed her, but strong hands caught her before she could fall. Through the haze of fatigue, she heard Whitfield's voice continuing, though the words seemed to come from a great distance. "Your father's debt is paid, Miss Morrison. Marcus Whitfield's name has been cleared not through the defeat of 20 men, but through the demonstration that honor can be restored by someone willing to risk everything for principles that transcend personal advantage. Rest now, knowing that you have achieved something that will be remembered long after we are all forgotten." As Isabella slipped into unconsciousness, the last thing she saw was Vincent Torres approaching with a cloth to clean her father's blade, his movements showing the kind of reverence normally reserved for religious artifacts. The challenge was over, but the legend of what had transpired in a forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of Philadelphia was just beginning. The torches continued to burn as night claimed the city, their light bearing witness to the end of one story and the birth of another, a tale that would be whispered in fencing academies and told around fires for generations to come, growing with each telling until it became the kind of legend that inspired others to discover what they too might achieve when pushed beyond the limits of what they believed possible. In defeating 9 masters and earning the respect of 11 more, Isabella Morrison had done something far more significant than winning a contest of arms. She had proven that the human spirit, when tested by impossible odds and sustained by unshakable purpose, could transcend every limitation. The challenge was complete, the honor restored, and the legend born. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.